Hello, my name is Dr. Lauren Mackay, and today I'm going to be talking about Henry VIII's third queen, Jane Seymour, for Natalie Grueneger's All Things Tudor Queens and Consorts for August. Now, you might be wondering why I chose Jane Seymour. Admittedly, I tend to do a lot more of research on the Boleyn family and the life and career of Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis, and my favourite queen is actually Catherine of Aragon, but Jane Seymour has always been something of an enigma to me, and I am quite passionate about going back into the archives, into the sources, and reassessing and reanalyzing the lives and reputations of Tudor individuals, and trying to work out sometimes if perhaps the reputations are accurate, especially with Jane Seymour. These reputations, I mean, people are vilified, they're marginalized, they're dismissed. And I think sometimes we have to really go back and make sure that the sources are accurate, the evidence is accurate, and that we understand the true story. So as I said, basically, I don't take any Tudor reputation at face value. And with Jane Seymour, I think that's probably wise because her reputation isn't great. Now, there are two narratives when it comes to Jane Seymour. The first narrative is that she is this scheming, cunning, manipulative, cold-blooded, arrogant, uh, very aloof woman who would stop at nothing and no one to tear down Anne Boleyn and replace her as Queen of England. The other narrative is that she is dim-witted, uneducated, meek, submissive, a dormouse, basically. And I find between the two narratives that there's no real sense of Jane the woman. I think it's difficult with Jane because she just seems like such a blank canvas. And unfortunately, we've lost Jane Seymour in a way because we don't really have a sense of her ambitions, of her beliefs, of her fears, of her passions. She was real and she did exist. And so today we're going to go a little bit into her life and try and understand Jane Seymour a little better. Now, I have seen this portrait in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, which incidentally was actually Charles V's capital in the 16th century. It's a strange portrait. She looks very aloof, like she doesn't want to be there, like she's really, really late for a dinner engagement and sitting here is interfering with her plans for the evening. But also, she looks very bland. Her face really doesn't give anything away. All the attention is on her jewelry and her dress and her headdress. And we've lost sight of Jane Seymour completely, I feel like, in this portrait. And it's given ammunition to historians over the centuries to ask, what on earth did Henry VIII ever see in Jane Seymour? In fact, we treat her like a blank canvas, quite literally, and on that we project our own ideas of the sort of person that Jane was, but we dismiss any thoughts of vitality and of hopes and ambition and a personality above all. So what do we know about Jane Seymour and the Seymour family and the Seymour family history? The Seymours could trace their origins, like many families in the 16th century, back to the Norman invasion of 1066. The original name was actually Saint-Maur, and they hailed from a small village called Saint-Maur-Loire in the Turin region. For several centuries, they worked their way up slowly. They were small landowners, and apart from the odd knighthood, they weren't really important fixtures at court. But fortunes changed with a few advantageous marriages, one of which actually was between John Seymour, Jane's father, and Marjorie or Margaret Wentworth. Now, Marjorie or Margaret was the first cousin of none other than Elizabeth Howard, Anne Boleyn's mother. She was also the first cousin of Edmund Howard, which makes her related to Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, because Edmund was Catherine's father. Now, our evidence is scant about Jane's formative years. We know that she was one of 10 children, 6 of whom survived into adulthood. So they were all born at Wolf Hall, and Jane in about 1508. Jane had two younger sisters, Elizabeth and Dorothy, and three older brothers, Henry Seymour, and then two other brothers who were absolutely not liabilities of the Tudor age, Edward and Thomas Seymour. Now, the Seymours, as I said, they didn't really have any particular prominence, and Sir John Seymour wasn't a great man of court, but he was embarking on a pretty successful military career. And he emerges from the sources in about 1497 in his early 20s. And he's part of the Kentish contingency putting down the Cornish rebellion for Henry VII. What I find so fascinating about this is exactly the same contingency, it's the exact same battle, the same rebellion, the exact same battlefield actually, that a young Thomas Boleyn is also on. And he emerges in fact at the same time, and he's age 20 in this battle. It's one of those mind-boggling facts that you know that there are two men on the battlefield in the same period of time, and they are two fathers of two future queens of England. It's just one of those what-if moments in history. Now, we don't know what life was like for Jane Seymour growing up, but all of the children received a good education as befitting a gentleman's family of the 16th century. The problem is with Jane is we tend to compare, and we're always comparing Jane to her predecessors, but we certainly compare Jane's education and upbringing to that of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. We can't do that. We have to really look at her within her own context, because Catherine of Aragon received a royal education befitting a prince, and Anne Boleyn's education was kind of a fluke. Not everyone got to enjoy an upbringing at some of the most sophisticated courts of Europe. Jane didn't have those connections, she didn't have those opportunities, so she didn't have that background. But she was likely educated by her mother. We know she enjoyed outdoor sports like horse riding and hunting, and she was quite a good needle worker as well. Well, she was trained in needlework. You can tell I don't do needlework because I don't even know the terminology. But apparently her embroidery was quite beautiful, and it passed down through the centuries. And even Henry VIII became very enthusiastic about embroidery after her death. Now, Henry VIII was actually not Jane Seymour's first matrimonial rodeo. She was originally betrothed to William Dormer, the son of Sir Robert and Jane Dormer. And it was a match brokered by her cousin, Francis Bryan. Now, you can see here Francis Bryan in all his obnoxious glory from the Showtime series, The Tudors. I absolutely cannot stand Francis Bryan. Anyway, the interesting thing about Francis Bryan is this familial connection that he has to the Seymours. And it's quite a shame that we don't have so much evidence of this connection between the families, because I feel that would really help flesh out these relationships between family members. And it's something that we do miss in the sources with families like the Seymours. Now, this particular betrothal fell apart. It was rumored because the Dormers decided they didn't think the Seymours were good enough. Boy, did they miss out on that one. But the familial connection to the Howards that the Seymours now had helped secure two places for Jane and her sister Elizabeth to enter Queen Catherine's household as ladies-in-waiting. So sometime in the 1520s, Jane and her sister entered Catherine of Aragon's household. It's there that obviously she begins to admire her queen, and she also holds a deep affection for the Princess Mary. Now, there's an interesting and salacious piece of gossip around the Seymour family, but this doesn't actually exist in their time. It actually comes about a century or so later. And it's this myth that Sir John Seymour, Jane's father, had an illicit affair with his daughter-in-law, Catherine Filial, the wife of his son, I should say, Edward. This theory has endured because it's so diverting, but the evidence is flimsy and absurd, because it begins in the 17th century with an ecclesiastical writer, Peter Healy, who wrote that Edward Seymour had learnt magic, of all things, whilst travelling to France in 1527, and he used that magic to spy on his wife and caught her in an embrace with a mysterious gentleman. A little bit later, another writer alleged that Catherine was known by his father or her father-in-law before the wedding. And that's it. That's really all we have. We're not even sure if we're talking about the right Seymours or the right John or the right, it's one of those myths. It's interesting because it's not unlike the myth that Henry VIII had an affair with Anne Boleyn's mother, Elizabeth. It's one of these myths that's become kind of entrenched, and every now and then it's rolled out in the history books, but there's no evidence, and I think we need to put that to bed. Now, Jane Seymour left court with Catherine of Aragon's fall, but she returned sometime in 1535 to serve the new Queen Anne Boleyn. Now, 1535, of course, was a momentous year for the Seymours. Jane was in Anne's household, and they hosted, well, her family, I should say, hosted the royal couple at Wolf Hall in Wiltshire at the end of the Summer Progress, which we all know about. We don't know how this all came about between Henry and Jane, what sort of interaction they had at Wolf Hall, but following this progress, within a few months, Henry VIII made it very clear that he was quite smitten with Jane Seymour and was sort of grooming her, I think, to be his mistress. And a faction begins to form around Jane Seymour. Now, this idea of factions, political factions, didn't start with the Seymours. It actually started with the Boleyns. Prior to Anne Boleyn, queens were safe on their thrones. If you're anointed, that's it. There's not really much that can get in the way. But with Anne's success, all of that changed. And now simply being queen doesn't keep you safe. So factional intrigue begins with Anne's ascension. And really what happens with the Seymours, it's just following on from that. If Anne can be queen, anyone can be queen. So the problem with Anne Boleyn is that she wasn't necessarily all that popular with the nobility in England. She had made enemies. Her religious agenda wasn't everyone's cup of tea. And her perceived treatment of Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary did her no favors. So the court watched as Henry VIII began to woo another woman under the nose of his wife. And while Henry VIII has considerable experience in these sorts of affairs, it's hard to really get a sense of Jane during this particular courtship. Now, historians have often used and perpetuated the contrast between Anne and Jane. So Anne being this striking, intelligent, passionate woman, and Jane is the exact opposite. She's bland and she's pale and she's shy. And that must be why Henry VIII made that choice, because she was the exact opposite. I don't think it's that simple. Obviously, Jane had something in her personality that did attract Henry. He's not a complete idiot. Anyway, but I think we have to stop pitting Jane and Anne against each other, because Henry is the man pulling the strings here. They are two women working in this male-dominated society, and it's not them, it's him. He's the problem. So that's just my personal opinion. Now, throughout the first months of 1536, Jane is coached by some of her supporters, including her cousin Nicholas Carew, who of course was also a Boleyn cousin. Now, Cromwell probably played a part as well, so everyone's sort of working around Jane to make sure she understands the importance of what's going on, or at least knows how to handle things. And of course, we have the famous occasion where Henry VIII sends Jane Seymour a purse of money with a letter. She was probably forewarned that he was going to do something like this, and so she knows how to handle it. She's making, she makes a real theatrical display of her virtue, which is quite right. She kisses the letter and she doesn't read it, and she says that she would rather Henry VIII send her money when she makes an honorable match. So it's a diplomatic way of extricating herself from a sort of delicate situation. But we shouldn't be cynical about this. Anne was very much the same in the sense that she wouldn't be Henry VIII's mistress. She was worth more than that. I think we have to understand that with Jane Seymour as well. Why should she just settle for being a mistress? She's better than that. She's more than that. So I think we have to admire that in Jane as well, this sense of herself and her own particular identity and importance. If you want me, you're going to have to do better than that. So I think then the situation changes and Henry thinks, I can do this again, I've done it once. And then I think it begins to feel real for the Seymours, and they do start to work a little harder and a little faster to make things happen, because all of a sudden this is an actual reality. Now, there is this idea that there was a hasty change of the Seymour family crest. The original crest, this isn't their crest, by the way, but it's a beautiful depiction of a peacock, because that was the original Seymour crest. Now, historians have often said, oh, the Seymour crest was this peacock, it was a symbol of pride, and this wasn't something they could be associated with, and so they had to change it to something else. There's no reason why a family would choose an emblem that would have such a negative connotation, especially one of the 7 deadly sins being pride. We have to understand the importance of the peacock and the symbolism of the peacock. The peacock actually represents immortality and rebirth, and it's considered sacred in many cultures and religions, including Christianity. They also are seen to represent everlasting life, because apparently their flesh doesn't decay very quickly. I don't know who tested this, but apparently it's a thing. So they are also associated with Christ as well. And they are also great and natural predators of snakes. So throughout the Mughal Empire, and even in India today, you see peacocks, because peacocks will willingly go after any snake, from king cobras to whatever. And of course, we know what the snake and the serpent represents in Christianity. So the peacock is a very important emblem. That's why it was the Seymour family crest. It had nothing to do with pride. This was quite a beautiful symbol of their family. The reflection of the peacock actually happens to be none other than the phoenix. The phoenix also represents immortality and rebirth. And so it wasn't really that much of a stretch to change the family crest from the peacock to the phoenix. And that's what they did. Was it political? Potentially. I think perhaps they were cognizant of being seen in any negative way. And of course, it's very easy for people to use the peacock in that particular pejorative way, in that pejorative sense. So yes, perhaps it was something that they consciously did, but I don't think we have to be cynical about it. It's a very minor change, but the message and the meaning and the importance of it to the Seymour family remained. So I think that's an important point to make. Now, we know how it goes in the first weeks of April and May of 1536. We know Jane Seymour leaves court because she's told to leave court. She's now being publicly courted by Henry VIII. Henry and Cromwell move against Anne and her co-accused. They are executed on farcical charges, and voila, Henry is single, and he just so happens to have a betrothed he prepared earlier. So he marries Jane within days of Anne's execution. Now, we all wonder what Jane must have felt at the destruction and death of her queen. We have no idea what she felt for Anne, but again, we have to be careful not to pit Jane against Anne. These are 2 women living in impossible situations, and Jane is not an accessory to Henry's crime against his second wife. Now, though Anne, as I said, was not necessarily popular, Jane wasn't either to begin with. Many found Henry's hasty execution of his second wife to be abominable. Especially the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis thought it was just so vile and so evil of the King of England to dispatch his second wife in such a violent way. And Chapuis didn't really get Jane Seymour at first. He talks about her being haughty and aloof, and he's not really sure where this woman came from and why she's in a position of power. Why can't Henry just marry a princess like every other king? Anyway, interestingly, once Jane Seymour becomes queen, we see a different woman emerge. Now, almost immediately, once Jane is queen, we see her sincere and deep love and respect for Henry's daughter, Mary. And there is something so admirable about the way that Jane tries to reconcile Henry with his daughter Mary after such a tremendous rift because of what happened to Catherine of Aragon. I think what's really interesting as well is the way that Jane manages a delicate situation like this. You know, Anne invited Mary to call her mother. Jane just took it as fact that she was never going to replace Catherine of Aragon in Mary's life, so she would never ask that, but she does build this wonderful bond with Mary, and it's a wonderful element of Jane's personality and her character for sure. So Jane as queen, she displayed, from what we understand, a very urbane manner. She had a gentle touch. She seems to charm everyone around her. And accounts of her describe her easy grace when she interacts with people at court. And whatever his first impressions, Chapuis actually discovered quite quickly that he had found a queen that he could admire and revere almost as much as he had Catherine of Aragon. And you know that Chapuis really likes you when he gives you a title. And the title he gave Jane was Pacificator, yes, which is basically preserver or guardian of the peace. In fact, it's through Chapuis' dispatches that we get a sense of this woman who never really had the opportunity before in her life to hold her own in conversation, to be seen as a woman of power. And Jane does show a degree of political acumen and diplomacy. So in her meetings with Chapuis, it's actually Henry who seems a little unnerved by how well Jane does, because she has these skills. And there's even evidence that Henry didn't want Jane to be this kind of wife at all. And he actually, there are accounts of him sort of muzzling her, not literally, but figuratively muzzling her. And he wasn't happy with her unending support for Princess Mary. He wanted Mary to submit to his will. And the last thing he wanted was his wife on his daughter's side. So I think there's definitely evidence that the kind of queen that Jane was evolving into actually wasn't what Henry had in mind. Now, when it comes to Jane's queenship, we hit a snag in the sources. And Chapuis is arguably one of our most important sources for the period. And if you don't believe me, please go out and try and write a book on the period without him. But the problem is, from about December 1536 to, I think it's November 1537, the majority of his dispatches have disappeared. And I know because I've looked for them. I've been in Vienna, I've gone everywhere, I can't find them thus far. We know he's still writing because we're getting Charles V's responses. So the problem with this is that Chapuis is so meticulous in his attention to detail and his descriptions. And without his descriptions of Jane, in the same way that he described Anne and Catherine in such detail, I think that we have missed this vital perspective of the period, and that includes Jane herself. And I think it contributes to why we don't get a sense of Jane as queen, and perhaps why she hasn't had such a lasting impact on queenship studies of the period. Now, what we do know, however, even despite having to deal with the absence of Chapuis' documents, is that she, as I said, was very much a pacemaker. She does show a lot of empathy. She shows understanding and compassion for her subjects. And we see this especially during the rebellion known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was the dangerous rebellion opposing the dissolution of the monasteries. Jane shows extraordinary courage in pleading with Henry to spare the leaders of the rebellion, and she does this publicly as well. She tries to intercede on their behalf. I think Jane identifies with their cause, and although she had managed Henry pretty well up to this point, and let's face it, managing Henry would have been a full-time job, she overreaches herself in this particular incident, and Jane is actually told that she's not to speak of such matters and she's not to meddle into his affairs again. So Henry publicly rebukes Jane. But I think it's very interesting that this is such a human reaction that Jane has, and it's one that I think is overlooked quite often. And again, it's a really important element of her character, this compassion that she has, and that she's willing to stand up because this woman has a conscience. And I think that's very important. And Jane was beginning to develop a voice. And again, I think that Henry was doing his best to silence it. Now, the good thing, I guess, for Jane is that she could do no wrong once she became pregnant. And of course, Henry and the country were overjoyed when in October of 1537, Jane Seymour gave birth at Hampton Court to the long-awaited legitimate male heir, Prince Edward, the future Edward VI. I think that this would have secured her. And I think also we start to see evidence of Jane's queenship. I think she was trying to emulate that of her mother-in-law, Elizabeth of York. I think she was sort of the role model and a template on which Jane was basing her queenship. So had she lived, I think Jane Seymour would have been an incredibly successful queen. But of course, we know that Henry and Jane's joy was short-lived, because on the 24th of October, 1537, Jane died of complications from childbirth. Henry had his heir, but he had lost his queen, and he hadn't even ordered it this time. But on a serious matter, he was clearly utterly devastated. And I think it's quite touching as well is Princess Mary's grief at the loss of her stepmother. Her grief was quite evident. She kept to her room. She only emerged as a chief mourner at the royal funerary procession through London. I mean, this was, I think, for Mary also a role model and someone that she had deeply loved. And it's quite tragic that someone that she loved the way almost as much as she loved her mother had also been torn from her. So Jane's funeral was, I think, inspired by that of her mother-in-law, Elizabeth of York, because they used a number of templates that had been used for Elizabeth of York's funeral as well. And there were a number of privy councillors scrambling to make sure that the funerary procession and the lying in state, that everything was perfect. Interestingly, the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, seems to have had enormous respect for Jane, because he actually ordered 100 masses to be said for Jane's soul. And he also even asked Cromwell whether he thought perhaps a dirge should be played at St. Paul's Cathedral, if that was appropriate. So I think that Jane's loss was felt not just by king and country, but by those who had grown to know her personally. And I think this is very interesting. This absence of Jane is felt so keenly. Now, Jane was interred in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. She doesn't really have, there's no brilliant tomb. She's under, if you've ever been there, she's under the slabs, now lying next to Henry, which I'm sure was not probably what she would like. But she has a moving epitaph, and which is there, you can see it, and it says, "Here lies Jane, a phoenix who died in giving another phoenix birth. Let her be mourned, for birds like these are rare indeed." So for me, as I said, Jane still remains an enigma, and I'm always searching for these lost documents to give a sense of Jane Seymour, the woman and the queen, beyond the simple narratives and the stereotypes that we've attributed to her. I think that Jane Seymour and her family, I mean, the story of the Seymours is the story of every 16th century family, working their way up, working around the very font of patronage and opportunity, which is the King of England himself. They're operating in a very different time from us. And we have to understand that we can't compare and we can't judge. Jane Seymour, I think the tragedy of Jane Seymour is that we'll never get to know what woman she truly was and what queen she might have been. But I think we can see that beyond the stereotypes and beyond the blame and the vilification, there is a real woman. She is complex, and she is human, and she is worthy of further study. So I hope you've enjoyed me talk today about Jane Seymour, and that you also feel there might be more to her story. And I hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope you go out and read more about Jane Seymour, and perhaps we can change these old stereotypes and start getting something new out there into the Tudor historiography. Thank you so much.